So we've all heard of the horrific escapades of ISIS in the Middle East and the international effort to crack down on the group in Syria, Iraq, and beyond. But what about Southeast Asia? Just recently, you may have seen that the US was considering airstrikes against radical Islamic militants in the small island nation of the Philippines, and subsequently, mainstream news outlets stopped covering the developing situation almost entirely because of American inaction. Or so we think. But that doesn't mean the problem just stops. This conflict could potentially lead to an influx of terrorist activity in Southeast Asia that could go as far to even threaten Australia. But before we get into that, let's talk about why ISIS is even in the Philippines in the first place. So strap in, because this is about to get almost as complicated as Syria. The Philippines has historically been a Roman Catholic majority nation, with 90% of its population today belonging to the faith. Many Muslims, which make up much of the remainder of that 10%, have clustered on the Philippines' southernmost island of Mindanao. This province is actually a majority Muslim, containing about 5 million people belonging to the Islamic faith. And with any historically Muslim majority area, Mindanao in particular, dating back to the late 1300s, Islamic way of life gains a foothold and establishes itself amongst the population and government. The call for a unified Muslim province within the Philippines had been a continuous issue, and in 1989 the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao was officially established on the southwestern portion of the island, where much of the Islamic population of the Philippines resided. The country has recently had some trouble with extremist groups popping up within Mindanao. For years, the Filipino government have quarreled with loosely connected and minor jihadist groups, but that was all soon to change. Come 2016, an Islamic terrorist group known as Maut, named after the two brothers Abdullah and Amarkayan Maut, who founded it, were linked to a bombing that occurred in Filipino President Duterte's hometown of Davao City in Mindanao. Later that same year in November, Maut claimed ownership of its hometown of Butig, and even went as far as to hang the ISIS flag there. President Duterte, whose primary focus had been on his controversial crackdown against illegal drug trafficking in the country, had left the growing problem of terrorist groups seizing land and conducting attacks within the Muslim-majority province of Mindanao alone up until this point. In an effort to decry these militants, Duterte, brash as ever, went as far to say that he would eat the liver of Islamic extremists. But not only did he say he would cannibalize these radicals, no, he even taunted them and told them they could burn down the city of Marawi, and well, they got to work on that. Maut formed an alliance with another Islamic terrorist group in the region, Abu Sayyaf, which had been responsible for kidnapping and piracy in Southeast Asian waters, and whose actions have prompted the Malaysian, Indonesian, and Philippine governments to conduct joint naval patrols on the seas between their countries. On May 23, 2017, a coalition of the Maut and Abu Sayyaf terrorist groups, pledging allegiance to ISIS, seized the major city of Marawi in Mindanao province. Upon this action, the group saw an influx of foreign fighters from neighboring Indonesia and Malaysia, but some have come as far as Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and even Chechnya in Russia, and the ISIS affiliate is even trying to get Australian Muslims to join their ranks. The Filipino military was quick to react, with military forces descending on the city to combat the militants and martial law being imposed on the province of Mindanao, initially for 60 days, but now until the end of 2017. Marawi's population has seen hardship as a result of the war zone that suddenly opened up, with nearly 360,000 people from the city and surrounding areas having been displaced, many living in evacuation centers and tents. Now, the fighting within the city has been brutal, to say the least. So far, 3,000 Filipino troops have been dispatched to the city to combat a proportionally smaller group of radicals, but they've run into many issues. Filipino soldiers are struggling because they're used to fighting in the jungle and haven't been properly trained to deal with the harshness of urban combat. And much of the fighting is close quarters, door to door, and it's brutal, it's really harsh, and it's really taking a toll on these forces. As of August 8th, 122 Filipino soldiers are dead, and 528 opposing militants have also been killed. You think that's about 12% of the initial Filipino force that's been killed. So casualties are high. The ISIS-affiliated Abu Sayyaf Maut coalition now holds 1/5 of the city, including the area that used to be the economic and business center. The extremists have very skilled snipers perched at various spots throughout the battlefield, which have taken a severe physical and psychological toll on Filipino troops. Some militants are held up in mosques, but, and get this, because mosques are protected as cultural monuments by the government, the military isn't allowed to attack them. So this is effectively providing these radicals with safe havens in the middle of an active war zone. It's also believed that the militants have taken hundreds of Marawi civilians hostage and are reportedly using them as human shields in combat. The Filipino Air Force has been conducting airstrikes on the militants, but dumb munitions, aka unguided missiles, are being utilized, leading to many inaccurate ordnance drops, resulting in the decimation of Marawi's infrastructure and the demise of civilians caught up in the crossfire, plus at least one incident of friendly fire. President Duterte has only made the situation worse for civilians, mainly focusing on bolstering military defenses, instead of also focusing on humanitarian aid for the hundreds of thousands that have been displaced by the fighting. And he's even on record saying that it's civilians' responsibility to run to safety while the Air Force carpet bombs the city. Naturally, ISIS fighters have taken this and spun their own narrative, claiming that the Filipino government was responsible for the destruction of Marawi, and not them. Yet the terrorists fail to acknowledge that this military operation wouldn't have ever occurred in the first place without their seizing and torching of the city. But why did the United States offer to conduct airstrikes if this conflict is occurring in a space we aren't actively militarily involved in? Well, it turns out we're there already. As of June 2017, the United States has had a hand in this battle, providing aerial recon assistance via unarmed drone and spy planes to Filipino forces. Furthermore, U.S. Special Forces are apparently playing an quote-unquote advisory role on the ground to Filipino troops, and the official word is that U.S. ground troops are only there to advise active Filipino forces, and that they won't get directly involved. And I think this is obviously a front, and here's why. Currently, there are a number of operational U.S. military bases in the Philippines, and these are left over from the Cold War and still remain active to this day, likely to keep up U.S. military influence and presence in the Pacific. The Filipino Constitution permits allied foreign military action only when another organized foreign actor is invading their country. So, in the unlikely event that an all-out war breaks out on the Philippines, the U.S. can dispatch forces to defend the islands accordingly. And even though this threat from Islamic militants has largely been internal, it'd be no surprise that the US used it as a reason to deploy troops. And to go even further with this, the United States has maintained a counterterrorism task force in the Philippines since 2002, the Joint Special Operations Task Force Philippines. Task Force Philippines is comprised of about 500 to 600 men from the Army Special Operations Forces, Navy SEALs, Air Force Special Operators, and others from all four branches of defense. In fact, they even have a specific task force designated for the region Marawi is located, Task Force Mindanao. Though the main bulk of Task Force Philippines was officially disbanded in 2015 because operations against Al-Qaeda in the Philippines were considered complete, officials directly from the unit were left behind to continue to advise. Furthermore, it was actually confirmed by Brigadier General Restituto Padilla of the Filipino military that U.S. forces are actually on the ground in Marawi assisting Filipino forces, but that they're only allowed to act in self-defense. It's already been claimed that these special ops troops are only playing advisory roles, but is it crazy to think that the US may be more involved than what's reported? Certainly history has shown that. Absolutely not, because the US claims to be acting under the guise of collective self-defense, where if their forces are targeted or come under fire from hostiles, they can fight back and request support. Sounds like the self-defense thing Brigadier General Padilla said, right? Well, turns out that the concept of collective self-defense has already been used against al-Shabaab militants in Somalia, except that operation was offensive and not defensive. And I really wouldn't put it past the US military to once again utilize this tactic in offensive operations with the Filipino military against ISIS forces in Marawi and claim that it's because of collective self-defense. And the US government has even stated, when asked if their forces would play a combat-centric role or not, their answer was, for security reasons, we are not able to discuss specific technical details. So clearly there's more there. It's probably already happened at this point, it's just that it's classified, and we won't be told about it. So to recap, US troops' role in this conflict. They're providing aerial reconnaissance for Filipino forces via spy planes and unarmed surveillance drones. They're officially acting in advisory roles for Filipino ground forces, are currently with some Filipino ground troops on the ground, but can apparently only act in self-defense, and unofficially but very likely are directly participating in combat against ISIS militants in tandem with Filipino forces. And now here's where it gets confusing. President Duterte claims that he's against US military intervention in the Philippines. It can be theorized that he holds this view, and is a heavy critic of the US because he doesn't want a foreign power meddling in his own country's affairs, and the fact that the US has critiqued his brutal drug war. Duterte said that he was unaware of US Special Forces present in Marawi, even though it's already been stated that they're officially providing assistance to the Filipino military in a number of ways and from multiple Filipino military officials. Whatever you hear from any source, the US is there, it's a fact, it's happening. And President Duterte claims he didn't even ask for their support anyway, which is honestly the more believable of his statements considering that it was the US that suggested it conduct airstrikes, not the Filipino government. And we're not done yet. We're going to make it even more chaotic by throwing in a terrorist group that's fighting against the ISIS-affiliated Abu Sayyaf Maut alliance and the Filipino government. Pretty much a three-sided war. And what if I told you that they were called MILF? The Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF for short. Which, come on guys, you really couldn't pick a better name. I mean, you... a terrorist group named MILF. So the group has been a thorn in the Filipino government's side for quite some time now, with the two signing and subsequently breaking ceasefire agreements leading to the death of more soldiers, militants, and civilians alike. And it didn't really help that MILF declared a jihad on the country and its citizens either. The group has even admitted to sending 600 of its fighters to join Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan back in the early 2000s, and that Osama bin Laden himself sent money to the Philippines, though it denies ever receiving said funds. So these guys are basically pissed that ISIS has moved in on their turf and are now competing to be top jihadists in the Philippines. It's really just a whole big mess, kind of like Syria, where you got multiple terrorist groups fighting each other. Now going back to more domestic issues, the martial law imposed on the Filipino government on Mindanao has been extended until the end of 2017 from the initial 60 days, because military forces want to try to root out terrorists that are trying to blend in with local Muslim communities in the region. Police Superintendent Roy Ga of Iligan City of northern Mindanao lays it out pretty clearly. We have to profile the Muslim areas. This conflict is in Marawi, unfortunately. It is going to be committed by Muslims, so we have to make sure there are no sympathizers with the terrorists in this area. Now, it really seems like the Filipino government is preparing for the long haul with this situation. I think they expected this problem to be resolved pretty quickly, but they're being shown otherwise, as fighting still continues in Marawi to this day. Also, the assistance offered by the United States to conduct airstrikes on these militants has seen no developments. I don't think the Filipino government has considered it to this date. So what we're dealing with here is a situation much like Syria. We have a joint terrorist group affiliated with ISIS seizing a major city out of nowhere in a Muslim-majority region of the Philippines. We got a Filipino military campaign to retake the city that was supposed to be quick and easy, but troops have run into harsh urban combat conditions they weren't anywhere near prepared for. You got unguided airstrikes that are decimating Marawi's infrastructure and catching civilians in the crossfire. You got the US involved with ground troops that are officially in advisory roles, but are most likely directly combating the militants, as shown by other actions by US forces around the globe, under the guise of collective self-defense. You got the president of the Philippines denying that there are any US troops present in his country, even though Filipino military officials have confirmed otherwise. You got foreign fighters pouring in from all over the Middle East and Southeast Asia to reinforce the militants. You got Australia right on the doorstep of this. And I imagine they're considering whether or not to strike the potential caliphate that's swarming right next to them in the name of national security. And to top it all off, you got a rival terrorist group called MILF, of all things, fighting against ISIS and Filipino government troops in order to be the top terrorist group in the country. That's what's going on in the Philippines.
الشعب يقول اني حاكم كريم ايوه لك تعرفون من هالشخص يا ماذر فكر لك وين الويد ولا لك وين الدخان ولا لك دخن كالكبير عضهم ركضهم مثل بولت خلي يسمعني يعني طلع الصوت عربي حبيبي يلا نجتمع نحط فردقات سمعين ببيت الرقص بالكلاب سكرانين خدرين الكل ينتخلون حياة مأساة ولا تمنع انسجمون